Okay, everybody, welcome to Class 4 of the Chicago Area Homeopathy Study Group. I'm Dr. Ezgur, and we're going to continue on. Today is December 8th, 2009, and we're going to continue on learning about homeopathy. So where we left off last time was in the outline under Roman numeral 3, D like dog, number 2. And we were talking a little bit at the end of last class about how to take the remedy as needed. And this is a really important concept, so I think I'm going to go over it again just to make sure we understand it. The reference for this is to look at, actually there's an error in the outline. It says see the what is homeopathy paper, but actually you have to see the essential information handout. And on page 4 of that, the top, talks about how to take the remedy as needed. So the whole point in homeopathy, as I've talked about always, is that we want to individualize the prescription, individualize everything about it, how it's given, how often it's given, all these things. The best way to give the remedy is as needed, and I'll explain what that is specifically. The more experience you have with this, the easier it will be to understand how to give the remedy as needed. So there are some guidelines in some of the books that tell you, if it's acute versus chronic, how often to give a remedy depending on the potency and all of that. But really it depends on the patient, it depends on how sensitive the patient is, the nature of the condition, these kinds of things. So the general concept is that when you give the remedy, it triggers the healing reaction. As long as the healing reaction is continuing and the patient is improving, you don't need to continue taking the remedy. When after the improvement has sort of slowed down and kind of plateaued, that's when you want to give the remedy again. Or after you've seen the improvement and the improvement is kind of plateaued and you miss that opportunity and the patient starts to relapse a little bit and get a little worse, that will be the time to take the remedy again. So you want to give the remedy before or right at the point that the patient starts to relapse, which is a worsening of the condition. The other time that the patient worsens when you would not want to give the remedy is called...
But when it's a placebo effect.
No. That is placebo aside. You give the remedy and the patient gets worse initially, right after giving the remedy, that's called. So if you give the remedy and the patient gets worse relatively soon, within a few minutes or a few hours or maybe a day or so.
It's the oops of the wrong.
In an acute case, it would be they might get worse within a few minutes or a few hours. In a chronic case, it might be a few minutes or hours or even a day or two. And that is called an initial aggravation. So if you give the remedy, the patient has an aggravation and is getting worse that way, you don't give the remedy again. You wait until the aggravation passes, and then improvement should commence, and then after the improvement goes away and it starts to relapse, then you give the remedy. So you can't just say, well, if you're doing better, don't take it. If you're getting worse, do take it, because there's two case scenarios of how a person could be doing worse. It could be either an initial aggravation, which happens, a worsening that happens right after giving the remedy, versus a relapse, which happens after there was already improvement, and then later they start to get worse again, and that's a relapse. So you give the remedy during a relapse, you don't give it during an aggravation. And if someone's continuing to improve, you don't really necessarily give it either. Okay. If you give the remedy too often, you run the risk of having aggravations. If you don't give it enough, you run the risk of improving slower than you should, or almost not at all. And if you give it just right, you'll get better, but you'll get better relatively quickly. It's not exactly when to give the remedy as needed. It's not an exact science, it's more a general guideline. So there's some leeway here. It's not like, oh, you were supposed to give it 10 minutes ago and you gave it 20 minutes too late, or you gave it an hour too late. That's okay most of the time. As long as you have the right remedy and you're reasonably close, you'll get a good result. Okay? But I would encourage you to continue to read that section of that paper, how to take the remedy as needed, and read it actually often, because it's a really important concept. It's probably one of the most important concepts to understand to be effective at treating homeopathy. The next thing, number 3 there in the outline, is the remedy given in water. So we've talked about giving either what we call a dry dose, which is just the dry pellet under your tongue and letting it dissolve, versus giving the remedy in water, which we also would call a wet dose. And the purpose of giving the remedy in water is to, in a sensitive patient, is to minimize the chances of an aggravation. So basically what you do is you put 1 pellet in 4 to 6 ounces of water. And again, this is in the essential information handout, so you don't have to write it all down. It's very well explained in there. But basically you put a dry pellet in a glass of water, you stir or shake that water quite vigorously, 20 to 30 times, and then you take just approximately a teaspoon of the water. And that teaspoon of the water is pretty much, it's a dose of the remedy, just like a dry dose or a pellet is. So for most people, 1 dry dose versus 1 teaspoon of that water is roughly the same thing. Some people will find they just respond better to wet doses, other people respond better to dry doses. Most people respond equally well to both. But sometimes taking it in water can minimize the aggravation. And the thing with the water is you can make it less and less likely to aggravate by doing serial dilution. So if someone's very sensitive, instead of just putting the pellet in 1 glass of water and stirring it and taking a sip, you could put 2 or 3 or 4 glasses on the countertop. Fill them all with water. You put the pellet in the first glass, stir it up, and take a teaspoon of that water and put it in the second glass of water. Stir that up, and then you could take a dose from that second glass, and that would be even less likely to aggravate than for the first glass. If someone's even more sensitive, you could stir the second glass up, take a teaspoon of that water, put it in the third glass, stir that up and take a sip of that, or put it in the 4th glass and keep going. So you can take a remedy from the first glass of water, from the second glass of water, from the 3rd glass of water, from the 4th glass of water, depending on how sensitive the patient is. Okay, so that's a great way. And then so if you identify that taking it from the 3rd glass of water is best, you do that, and then over time though, as they get less sensitive to that remedy, then maybe they may need to go to the 2nd glass of water. And then if they're responding to that pretty well, but starts to slow down, then maybe they need to go back to taking it from the 1st glass of water. And then if the reaction starts to slow down, the improvement isn't as great, then they might need to go to the dry dose again. So there's all kinds of ways to adjust how strong the effect from the remedy is based on how you do that. Another technique, instead of just taking a single dose of the remedy, you can take a double dose of the remedy. So a double dose is when if you take 1 single dose and you're waiting for a response and there's not much response, then sometimes I will recommend a patient take a double dose, which is taking 2 doses within 12 hours of each other. So you tell them, take it before you go to bed at night, and then again when you wake up the next morning. Or you could do a triple dose, take it before you go to bed, and then the next morning, and then again before you go to bed. So that'd be 3 doses, all within 12 hours of each other. But in acute conditions, which is mostly what we're going to be treating in this class, you're going to be taking it more often than that anyway. For acute conditions, generally you're going to be taking a remedy once every 10 or 20 minutes, it could be every hour, or it could be every 2 to 3 hours, but usually somewhere in there. For something acute, you're going from anywhere from a few minutes to every few hours, but not less than that as